During the Second World War, Germany brushed with its fingertips against the secrets capable of changing everything. But what could have been Hitler's bomb, the solar cannon, and the super Aryans ended in failures, trapped between sabotage, miscalculations, and political decisions that prioritized other weapons. This is the story of the projects that began with promises of sunlight and ended in shadows. The solar cannon and the dream of an orbital weapon. In the feverish minds of the Nazi hierarchs, war was not fought only on land, sea, and air. The sky itself, outer space, appeared as the ultimate frontier. There they placed the final promise of victory, a weapon that had no equivalent in any arsenal on the planet. It was not a conventional cannon, nor a rocket faster than the Allies. It was the sun turned into an executioner, reflected and directed like an incandescent scalpel over the Earth's surface. They called it, with grandiloquence and secrecy, the solar cannon. The plan, conceived in sketches and technical reports at the end of the 1930s, seemed taken from a science fiction novel. It consisted of launching into space a gigantic station equipped with a parabolic mirror of about 9 kilometers in diameter. That mirror would concentrate the rays of the sun into a narrow and devastating beam, capable of incinerating cities, melting tanks, or evaporating water reserves. The station would be manned. Several German technicians would live up there, regulating the orientation of the mirror and aiming the beam at any point on Earth. The logic behind the project rested on an indisputable fact. Nazi Germany had achieved tangible scientific and technological leadership in the field of rocketry. The best example was the V-2, projectiles of 14 meters in height and 12 tons, capable of flying at more than 5,700 kilometers per hour, and reaching an altitude of 80 to 90 kilometers before descending in ballistic fall. They were the first machines built by human beings to brush the edge of space. For their victims in London or Antwerp, they represented an invisible terror. They fell without warning, without sirens, without any chance of defense. But for the engineers, they were also the demonstration that the atmosphere could be crossed, and that space was not a distant dream but a horizon within the reach of their calculations. The idea of the solar cannon arose from that limitless confidence. If they had been able to launch a rocket that surpassed the sound barrier and crossed the skies, why not imagine a colossal mirror orbiting the Earth? Wernher von Braun himself, the architect of the V-2, had fantasized in his writings about space stations and orbital platforms. In the context of Nazi propaganda, those visions were deformed into military projects, the conversion of space into a battlefield from which to dominate the world. The operation of the weapon on paper was almost perversely simple. The parabolic mirror, assembled piece by piece in orbit, would concentrate sunlight on a point of the Earth's surface, raising the temperature to lethal levels. It was said to be capable of burning entire cities, drying rivers and frying enemy fleets at sea. An attack of this kind would generate no thunder or explosions. It would be a silent beam, a column of solar fire falling upon the target. The victim would not hear the approach of planes nor the whistle of a projectile. It would simply be consumed by heat. Naturally, the technical feasibility was another story. In the 1940s, Germany could launch suborbital rockets, but it was far from putting satellites into stable orbit. The V-2 reached considerable heights, but did not have enough velocity to remain circling the Earth. Even so, the engineers did not rule out that with more powerful engines and evolved designs, that might be possible in the near future. And in the logic of the Third Reich, which conceived of itself as an empire of 1,000 years, thinking in decades was not a limitation. What is disturbing is that, although the solar cannon never went beyond the plans, its technological roots did bear immediate fruit. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union launched a hunt for the engineers of the V-2. Von Braun and his team ended up in Texas, working first for the American Army and later for NASA. It was their knowledge that enabled the development of the Redstone, Jupiter, and finally the Saturn V rockets that would carry the astronauts to the Moon in 1969. What in Nazi documents had been a warlike fantasy, in the Cold War became space stations, satellites, and orbital weapons in projects such as Reagan's Star Wars. The Nazi solar cannon, then, was not a baseless joke, but the delirious link in a chain of advances that truly shaped the modern world. Without the V-2, without the German obsession with rocketry, perhaps the space race would have taken another generation to begin. But what von Braun had imagined as voyages to Mars or habitable stations, under Nazism became visions of cities incinerated by concentrated rays of sunlight. The symbolic component cannot be ignored. The Nazis sought an absolute weapon, a technological manifestation of their supposed racial and ideological superiority. The solar cannon, with its incandescent eye in the sky, was the perfect metaphor for that divine power they wanted to claim, a Reich that not only dominated the Earth but extended its dominion to the cosmos. It is no coincidence that Himmler, obsessed with occultism, spoke of space as the new frontier of the Aryan race. Today, when we look back at these projects, it is easy to smile at the excess, but it is worth remembering that, in parallel, the same engineers who sketched orbital mirrors built the first ballistic missile and the first operational jet fighter in the world. If they achieved so much in the midst of a war that devoured resources and men, what might they have achieved in 20 years of peace? Perhaps the solar cannon would not have remained an absurd anecdote, but the first military orbital station in history. The sun, source of life, turned into an instrument of death. That was the essence of the project. The Third Reich not only wanted to conquer territories, it wanted to rewrite humanity's relationship with the cosmos, to appropriate elemental forces and turn them against its enemies. The solar cannon, although never built, condenses the spirit of Nazi science. A blend of ingenuity, arrogance, and brutality, capable of dreaming the impossible and ignoring entirely the ethical consequences. The rockets, V2, and the threshold of the space age. When the European skies began to fill with smoke and burning metals, few imagined that among those columns of fire the gateway to a new world was being forged: space. That threshold was not opened by a clean and solemn rocket, but by projectiles conceived to kill and terrorize. The V2, giants of 14 meters roaring with liquid combustion, pushed by a lethal mixture of alcohol and oxygen, were at once weapon and experiment, symbol of German technological ambition and of the human price that accompanied it. Launched from hidden platforms, the V2 fell with fierce indifference. They rose, described a parabola, and then returned to explode among houses and markets. Their victims did not hear the approach. Unlike bombers, the missile did not announce its arrival. For London, they were terror. For the scientists who designed them, a demonstration that man could project energy beyond the limits of the atmosphere. They reached altitudes that brushed the border of space, tens of kilometers, and that changed the technical imagination of a generation. What began as a ballistic weapon became, in the post-war period, the skeleton of the space race. Wernher von Braun and his team, with the obsessive dedication of propulsion craftsmen, proved that trajectory control and mastery of liquid fuels were feasible. Their V2 demonstrated principles: large-scale stable combustion, guidance by gyroscopic systems, structures that withstood extreme accelerations. They were also harsh lessons about logistics, mass production, and, sadly, about the forced labor that sustained them. There is no scientific glory that does not drag a human shadow when looked at honestly. That same technology, torn from the European political map at the end of the war, passed through different hands and destinies. Under different flags, the brains and the plans migrated to bases in Texas and to Soviet factories. The memory of the V2 was not erased. It evolved. The same concepts that carried bombs to cities were reused to put satellites into orbit, to test rocket stages, and to imagine stations where two men could one day write the first human logbook outside the Earth. The transition was dizzying. The tool of terror became an engine of exploration and at the same time an element of strategic value in the Cold War. In that logic of instrumentalization, the German nuclear program is an awkward but inseparable piece. Rocketry and nuclear physics ran in parallel, feeding on the same institutes and, at times, the same ambitions. The interest in fission, its possible military use, and its potential to transform war into a completely different stage were on the table. It is no coincidence that the laboratories where moderation designs and high-risk experiments were discussed shared corridors with tables where engine blueprints and enormous pipes for combustion tests were debated. For now, I keep technical data and documents in reserve that would explain to what extent both programs, rocketry and nuclear, touched each other. I save them to incorporate with precision when you want us to go into detail. Meanwhile, the German military mind was not content with attacking from a distance. It dreamed of projecting intercontinental power through strategic bombers. Hence was born the ambitious and reckless project known as America Bomber. The idea was to produce an aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic and bombing targets on the east coast of the United States, a design that, had it materialized, would have forever reconfigured the idea of intercontinental war. Studies followed one another: giants with extended range, reinforced fuselages, enormous tanks, and high-efficiency engines. In the plans there were concepts of jet bombers and of monsters with unprecedented reach. Was there seriously intent to attack New York? In planning terms, yes. Among the maps and specifications, symbolic targets circulated: ports, industrial centers, logistical nodes, and New York appeared on many of those lists as the emblem of an economic and cultural enemy. The possibility of an attack was not only a military calculation, but also a psychological operation. Striking the American metropolis would mean proving that no one was out of the Reich's reach. Technically, the challenge was immense: navigating the Atlantic with precision, returning with sufficient fuel, evading Allied air superiority, and mounting large tonnage bombs. The resources required would have been colossal, and the war by then was already a well from which Germany could not extract men nor materials with the freedom demanded by a project of such magnitude. Even so, in the staff pantries and in the engineers' notebooks, there remained notes, load estimates, and sketches of attacks on United States urban centers. The America Bomber project also fueled research in radio navigation, improvised in-flight refueling, and fuselage designs that could withstand non-stop crossings. All of that, in practice, remained half done. The bombers that could fly with extended range arrived too late or in insufficient numbers. But the fear that the mere possibility generated had real psychological effects on public opinion and on Allied planners. The thread that links the V2, the nuclear program, and the America Bomber traces a critical line. Technology, when combined with a totalitarian vision of war, tends to become a project of total war. The rocket that spits death at the city, the reactor that could release unimaginable energy, and the bomber that crosses oceans are manifestations of the same expansionist logic. After the conflagration, that logic did not disappear. It was reassigned, recycled, and in many cases adopted by powers that, in bipolar competition, saw in technological supremacy the guarantee of survival and dominance. Therefore, when writing the history of the V2 and its legacy, it is not enough to narrate engines and altitude figures. One must trace the moral and political continuity that took science from the launch platforms to the space race and to nuclear deterrence. These rockets were the threshold. Their gunpowder was the first sentence of a story that would continue with satellites, with stations, and with arsenals that for decades hung over the planet the shadow of annihilation. The atomic mirage of the Third Reich. On the 1st of September of 1939, while German troops marched over Poland, a small group of physicists was summoned by the army to explore a discovery as recent as it was unsettling: nuclear fission. The Uranverein, the Uranium Club, was born. In theory, that circle could open the door to the most devastating weapon ever conceived. In practice, it would be a mirage, a labyrinth of miscalculations, scattered laboratories, and political decisions that ended up condemning the Third Reich's nuclear project to failure. At the head were illustrious names: Wernher Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Kurt Diebner, Walter Botha. They were figures of Europe's scientific elite, but operated in a poisoned context. Unlike the United States, which years later would concentrate thousands of technicians in Los Alamos under a centralized command, the German program fragmented from the beginning. Laboratories in Berlin, Leipzig, or Göttingen worked in isolation, without coordination or unified strategy. Each group pursued its own hypotheses, often contradictory. What in the Manhattan Project was a symphony, in Germany sounded like cacophony. One of the central problems was access to critical materials. To sustain a chain reaction, highly pure uranium and, above all, suitable moderators were needed to slow down neutrons without excessively capturing them. The so-called heavy water, deuterium oxide, was one of those indispensable materials for research lines testing the viability of experimental reactors. The Vemork plant in Rjukan, Norway, became a priority target after the German occupation of 1940. Its capacity to produce deuterium made it a key piece in any plan aiming to bring the Reich closer to the atomic threshold. But Wehrmacht and its facilities did not remain in German hands without resistance. The rough geography and political context gave rise to one of the most remarkable chapters of intelligence and commando warfare. The British and Norwegian operations aimed at frustrating heavy water production. In 1942, an attempt was made to neutralize the plant through an airborne assault, combined with the landing of troops in gliders, Operation Freshman, which failed tragically. The gliders crashed into the snow, many pilots and commandos died, and the survivors were captured by the Germans. The failure was a severe blow, but also served as a lesson for coordination between British intelligence and the Norwegian resistance. The response came with more cautious planning and with men who knew the terrain. In February of 1943, a small group of Norwegian commandos, trained by the British Special Operations Executive, managed to infiltrate the facility and carry out a precise and deadly sabotage. They destroyed the critical production circuit without causing a general collapse of the plant, but did interrupt the output of heavy water for months. The audacity of that operation, swift, surgical, and executed in extreme conditions, became a paradigm of commando warfare and had a clear strategic effect: to slow down, increase the cost, and above all, sow uncertainty about the viability of the supply that Uranverein needed. However, isolated attacks were not enough. After the initial sabotage, the Germans tried to rebuild and disperse production, and measures multiplied to transport the material from Norway to German facilities. It was then that naval and aerial warfare entered the scene. The convoys transporting materials became targets, and in one of the most controversial actions in February of 1944, the barge SF Hydro was sunk in the Tinsjø Fjord to prevent large quantities of heavy water from reaching Germany. The sinking caused civilian casualties, workers and transport personnel, and marked the harsh ethical dimension of war. The struggle to prevent the enemy from acquiring devastating capabilities was also fought upon the skin of civilians trapped between strategic priorities. The succession of sabotage, sinkings, and air raids raised the cost for the Reich. What in the laboratory notebooks seemed a feasible plan became logistically prohibitive. Producing enough heavy water, extracting uranium, and assembling a reactive industry capable of sustaining a weapon demanded resources the war no longer allowed. Germany never managed to have a stable and secure supply of the critical materials that would have made an accelerated atomic program possible. The most fatal error from a technical point of view was not only the lack of raw material, it was, to a large extent, conceptual. Repeatedly, Heisenberg and others calculated material needs enormously higher than what later physics proved necessary to reach critical mass in a bomb. For many military leaders, that overestimation was read as a sentence. The weapon was out of reach within wartime limits. It did not deserve the massive investment that diverting resources from programs promising more immediate tactical returns implied, such as the V-2 rockets or the Me-262 jet planes. There was therefore no deliberate conspiracy to halt the research. Rather, there were miscalculations, strategic judgments, and political priorities that determined the path. In June of 1942, Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker met with Albert Speer. There they explained that nuclear energy was real, but its military exploitation would require years of development and colossal resources. Speer, pragmatic and concerned with immediate efficiency, decided to prioritize rockets, jet aircraft, and submarines. Hitler, seduced by the immediacy of the V-2 or the Me-262, relegated the Uranverein to a bureaucratic corner. From then on, the German nuclear program became a laboratory experiment without budgetary or political priority, and with less human and material fuel than it truly required. The attempts continued in fragmentary forms. In Leipzig, an experimental facility suffered an accident in 1942 that cost an assistant's life. In Haigerloch in southern Germany, an experimental reactor was installed in an underground cave with uranium spheres suspended in heavy water as a moderator. When the Allies arrived in 1945 and discovered the caves, they found incomplete assemblies, calculation notes, and models. It was evident that the setups were far from criticality and that, even with work, they lacked the industrial scale that a nuclear weapon demanded. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Manhattan Project devoured billions of dollars, raised entire factories in Oak Ridge and Hanford, and gathered the best minds of Europe and America under one roof. What in the United States was absolute political will, in Germany was hesitation, distrust, and scarcity. The difference was not only in talent, it was in the concentration of efforts and resources. The United States set in motion a production and verification machinery on a scale that Germany, with a front open across all Europe and under bombing pressure, could not match. The irony is brutal. Germany had started the nuclear race earlier. German scientists were pioneers in discovering fission and conceptualizing reactors, but renounced it just when it could have maintained an advantage. Heisenberg himself was astonished in August of 1945 when at Farm Hall, the English mansion where he was interned along with other German scientists, he heard on the radio the news of Hiroshima. At first he believed it was Allied propaganda. Only after making new calculations did he understand he had overestimated the critical mass. The bomb was possible, and the United States had proved it. The history of the Uranverein also shows the difference in mentality between scientific programs. The German physicists responded cautiously to the regime's questions. Yes, a bomb was conceivable, but not in the short term. In the Third Reich, promising the impossible was dangerous. Those who guaranteed quick results received support and resources. Von Braun and the rocket engineers dared to guarantee results, and for that reason, they obtained disproportionate backing. Heisenberg and his peers, more prudent and honest about the difficulties, were relegated. The result was that Germany built thousands of V-2, developed jet planes and revolutionary submarine prototypes, but not a single operational nuclear prototype. The failure of the atomic project does not mean its legacy was harmless. Every step left traces later studied by Americans and Soviets: the Hagerlock reactor, the calculation notes on moderators and cross-sections, Hartex centrifuges, all were packed up and distributed as scientific spoils. The capture of archives and materials fed the post-war period. It contributed to programs that, during the Cold War, accelerated the proliferation of nuclear knowledge for civil and military purposes. The Uranverein did not give Hitler his miracle bomb, but it did sow ingredients, lessons, and warnings that would define the atomic era that followed. Ultimately, the Nazi nuclear program did not collapse for lack of scientific talent. It collapsed for lack of strategic focus, for political decisions that prioritized tactical effect over long-term investment, and for the effective intervention of sabotage and Allied operations that complicated essential logistics. Amid bombings, commandos in the mountains of Norway, and technical debates in general staff rooms, the possibility that the Reich would reach the bomb remained in the end what it was: a mirage. The Third Reich believed it brushed the secret of the sun, but stretched its hand in vain, and history, with all its ironies and tragedies, bore witness to the magnitude of what was attempted and to that which, thanks to a conjunction of factors, was never consummated: the secret submarines and the Kriegsmarine of the future. The Kriegsmarine, like the Luftwaffe and the rocketry departments, lived obsessed with the idea of transforming technological advantage into strategic dominance. When the war ceased to be a regional conflict and became industrial and total, the seas turned into an extension of technological competition. It was not enough to sink ships. It was necessary to design machines that could remake war itself, to dive deeper, to swim faster, to remain hidden for entire days, and thus break enemy superiority. From those desires were born the projects that promised to turn the U-boats into something different. Not simple surface hunters, but autonomous high-technology weapons capable of altering the classic concept of naval power. The starting point was a pragmatic need. The first U-boats operated mostly on the surface and suffered greatly from the expansion of Allied air escort and radar. The idea of a submarine that could operate most of the time submerged, with speed comparable to that of surface ships, was the obsession of the new German technical school. Designers and engineers sought two complementary paths: improving propulsion to erase the speed penalty underwater, and increasing electrical autonomy to sustain long immersions. In workshops and wind tunnels, solutions were outlined that today are read as the skeleton of modern submarine design. Work was done on more hydrodynamic hulls, integrated fins, profiles that reduced resistance, and on batteries with greater energy density. But perhaps the boldest innovation was the exploration of non-conventional propulsions, engines powered by oxygenated fuels that promised continuous power even while submerged. The principle was simple in its conception. If the submersible carried its own oxidizer or an oxygen generation system, it could sustain combustion without surfacing for air. In theory, this would allow submerged speeds never before imagined. The projects were not limited to incremental improvements. Some lines of research were radical: submarines with high-pressure turbines, semi-submersible designs combining surface and rapid submersion characteristics, and even proposals for small vessels, Walter engines, experimental prototypes designed for high-speed attacks. Many of these trials required exotic materials, finely controlled engineering, and extreme testing conditions. A single failed test was enough to expose how much the Kriegsmarine was betting at the edge of technical and human risk. Another experimental branch focused on low-scale but high lethality warfare. The Kleinkampfverbände, small combat units, developed torpedo boats, special mine payloads, and manned submersible motorcycles. They were desperate weapons and costly in lives, but they followed a logic. If the conventional front closed, tactical damage could be inflicted through sophisticated means that were relatively inexpensive in scale. At its core, the doctrine held that coastal control and naval sabotage could paralyze enemy logistical lines. Of all prototypes and proposals, two ideas stood out for their later influence. The first was the conception of the high-speed, long-range submarine, a vehicle designed to remain submerged most of the time, with improved batteries and an intelligent recharging system. That philosophy modified hull architecture, tank arrangement, and thermal management. Engine rooms had to dissipate less heat and allow rapid maneuvers. The second was the experiment with alternative propulsions, closed-cycle systems or engines that did not depend on ambient air, which, though incipient and with many failures, showed the technological direction that the post-war period would follow. Not all was cold engineering in those designs. There was a human and ethical component that should never have been ignored. Many projects were sustained by forced labor. Prisoners detained in inhuman conditions assembled components in underground galleries. The development speed achieved by certain programs cannot be dissociated from that moral cost. The decisions to prioritize rockets or submarines did not respond only to technical efficiency criteria. They responded to political priorities, to the preference of leaders seeking visible and spectacular results. When the machinery of decision-making turned to producing miracle weapons with propagandistic effect, the logistical programs requiring sustained labor and fine assembly were left at the mercy of the brutality of the war apparatus. As the war advanced and German industrial capacity deflated under Allied bombings, many projects remained at the prototype stage. But the war did not end with technology. It ended with the political map that would allow the continuation of those investigations in other hands. At the end of the conflict, the technical arsenals of the Kriegsmarine were captured, studied, and reused by the victors. It was no coincidence that post-war navies incorporated concepts that had been conceived in the German tunnels and drawing boards. The idea of a submarine that can remain submerged for long days and attack with absolute discretion became a standard in the nuclear and strategic patrol era. The most unsettling legacy is twofold. First, the confirmation that naval engineering can transform strategic warfare, not only sinking merchant ships, but maintaining a permanent and hidden threat that forces the enemy to reconfigure its routes, escorts, and war economy. Second, the reminder that technology, however brilliant, bears the imprint of those who produce it. A neutral invention in civilizing hands can be a catastrophe in the hands of expansionist doctrines. The U-boats transformed by German experimentation were not merely mechanical advances. They represented the ability to adapt science to political doctrines with all the human consequences that implies. Today, when we think of nuclear submarines, AIP systems, or high-density batteries, it is impossible not to recognize the influence of that alliance between strategic necessity and German technical audacity. The Kriegsmarine, in its quest to blur the line between surface and seabed, left notions that would define 20th century submarine warfare: invisibility as a weapon, autonomy as an advantage, and technology as the ever-changing face of naval strategy. The Walter submarines, the promise of underwater speed. While the V-2 rockets crossed the skies and the physicists of the Uran discussed critical masses and moderators, another secret front opened beneath the surface of the sea. It was the domain of naval engineers obsessed with a simple and devastating question: how to make a submarine stop being a ship that's submerged and become a true creature of the ocean. The answer was sought by a singular man, Helmuth Walter, who with his hydrogen peroxide turbines promised to revolutionize submarine warfare. The German submarines of the first half of the war were, strictly speaking, hybrids. They navigated on the surface most of the time and only submerged to attack or evade. They depended on diesel engines that required atmospheric oxygen, and their underwater speed was pathetically low. When Allied aviation multiplied and radar became omnipresent, this weakness turned into a death sentence. A U-boat caught on the surface had little chance of escape. The need was clear: an air-independent propulsion system capable of maintaining high underwater speeds and extending autonomy without surfacing. Helmuth Walter dedicated himself since the 1930s to researching fuels and alternative systems. His crucial discovery was the use of concentrated hydrogen peroxide, which when decomposed released steam and oxygen in enormous quantities. With that principle, he designed a closed-cycle turbine that could drive a submarine at more than 20 knots underwater, something unthinkable with conventional batteries. The concept was so radical that the prototypes built in Kiel surprised even the high command of the Kriegsmarine. The initial reports spoke of submerged speeds of 25 to 28 knots, when the Type 7 U-boats barely reached 7. A Walter could launch itself underwater like a manned torpedo, change course, and escape any escort. The first experimental models, the V-80 in 1940, and later the U-792 and U-794, confirmed that the idea worked. They were not operational units, but floating laboratories where peroxide tanks, turbines, and safety systems were tested. The trials were dangerous. Peroxide was unstable, corrosive, and highly explosive. It required almost surgical care in its handling. But the results convinced the technicians that they had found the key to a new type of submarine warfare. From 1943 onward, two classes of operational Walters were planned: the Type 17, small but fast, and the Type 18, larger, conceived as true oceanic hunters. At the same time, a hybrid system was designed, the Type 21, which did not use Walter turbines directly but incorporated many of their hydrodynamic and battery improvements, and which would end up being the most influential model in the post-war period. The Allies learned of the Walter project thanks to intelligence reports and the capture of incomplete prototypes. The mere idea that U-boats could move submerged faster than a destroyer on the surface was terrifying. It meant that escort tactics, anti-submarine barriers, and sonar would be insufficient against an invisible and fast enemy. In the midst of the Atlantic crisis, when convoys were vital, the threat of a super submarine hung like a ghost over the Allied planners. In practice, mass production never came. Hydrogen peroxide was difficult to manufacture in large quantities and extremely dangerous to store. Crew training required months of special preparation. Moreover, Allied bombings of German shipyards and factories paralyzed the plans. Only a handful of Walters were tested in wartime conditions, too late to alter the course of the conflict. What the Nazis could not exploit was capitalized on by the victorious powers. The British took prototypes and technicians to Portsmouth, where they studied every valve. The Soviets replicated Walter turbines in their experimental submarine classes. The Americans, more pragmatic, incorporated some ideas into their designs, but soon turned toward nuclear propulsion, more stable and durable. The true legacy of Walter was not the direct adoption of his turbines, but the confirmation of a principle. The submarine had to be a vessel conceived for prolonged immersion, not a ship forced to submerge. His studies in hydrodynamics, the teardrop shape, and the internal reorganization set the standard for all later designs. The Type 21, although it did not use T-Stoff, inherited that philosophy and became the ancestor of modern submarines. The project synthesizes the paradox of German science in the war: brilliant in conception, bold in experimentation, incapable of completing the industrial leap that would give it meaning. The Walter submarines were real, they sailed, they reached astonishing speeds. But they never arrived in sufficient number nor at the right moment. The promise of a transformed submarine war remained floating in technical reports and in the memories of a few privileged crewmen. However, when in the 1950s and 60s nuclear submarines appeared, capable of navigating submerged for months and at speeds above 25 knots, many saw the direct line that linked those giants with Walter's dreams. What had begun as a dangerous turbine driven by peroxide became atomic reactors silently propelling entire ships beneath the Arctic ice. The principle was the same: autonomy, speed, invisibility. In conclusion, the Walter submarines were the bridge between the wartime U-boats and the era of nuclear deterrence. They did not change the immediate course of the conflict, but they did anticipate the future. Like the V2 or the failed nuclear program, they show the constant of Nazi science: obsession with technological supremacy, inability to transform that obsession into immediate strategic results, and a legacy absorbed by those who did have the resources to bring it to completion. Mistel, the twin planes turned into flying bombs. The Luftwaffe engineers never stopped searching for ways to transform disaster into promise. When Allied air dominance became indisputable, conventional German bombers were being shot down en masse before reaching their targets. The response was as desperate as it was ingenious: to turn worn-out planes into flying bombs controlled by an attached fighter. Thus was born the Mistel program, one of the strangest and most radical experiments of the war. The concept seemed taken from a workshop of modern alchemists. An old Junkers Ju-88 was used, its cockpit removed, and its nose packed with a gigantic hollow charge of high explosive capable of piercing concrete armor. On top of it was mounted, by means of a special framework, a fighter, at first a Bf-109, later an Fw-190, which functioned as a guide and control platform. The set took off united. The pilot directed the parasite to the vicinity of the target, released the flying bomb, and returned with his light aircraft. The appeal of the Mistel was evident. It allowed striking heavily defended targets, bridges, shipyards, submarine bunkers, without risking large formations of manned bombers. The hollow charge of 3.5 tons could pierce meters of reinforced concrete and destroy coastal fortifications. In theory, it was the perfect solution to a strategic problem. The first tests, carried out in 1943, were encouraging. Simulated attacks were conducted against coastal structures in the Baltic, and reports indicated formidable destructive capacity. With Hitler increasingly fascinated by the miracle weapons, the Mistel received limited support, although never absolute priority compared with the V-2 rockets or the Me-262 jet aircraft. In 1944, the first operational units were formed. Actual use, however, ran into the harsh reality of war. The Mistel aircraft were slow, clumsy, and easily detectable. The Allied defenses, already experienced against V-1 and V-2, learned to track these hybrids shortly after their takeoffs. Even so, they achieved some partial successes. They seriously damaged the French battleship Courbet, used as a breakwater in Normandy, hit positions in the Seine Bay, and threatened targets in Poland and the East. The true dream was to use them against large strategic objectives, such as the Allied fleet at Scapa Flow, or even Soviet installations on the far side of the Eastern Front. There were also plans to arm Mistel combinations with Me-262 jet fighters, creating even faster and harder to intercept hybrids, though these versions never advanced beyond the experimental stage. The project reflected the German situation in 1944 to 1945. Feverish creativity, improvised solutions, and an excessive faith that a miracle weapon could reverse the inevitable. The Mistel did not change the course of the war, but it symbolized that final gamble on technology as a lifeline. After the defeat, the Allies carefully studied the captured Mistel remains. The concept of composite aircraft interested the British and the Americans, who experimented with their own versions in the following years, though none reached production. The legacy of the Mistel remained more in imagination than in the arsenal, as a reminder of how far desperation can go when science bows to total war. The jet aircraft, the superior air force. The Luftwaffe in 1944 was cornered. The skies of Germany had ceased to be its own space and had turned into an inferno of Allied heavy bombers, escorted by fighters that penetrated to the industrial heart of the Reich. Every day, columns of smoke rose over Hamburg, Berlin, or Essen. The German response could not consist of more of the same. It needed a qualitative leap, a technological rupture that would erase at once the enemy's advantage. It was then that the jet engine ceased to be a laboratory experiment and became the regime's last desperate card. The most famous of those projects was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter in history. With its two Jumo 004 turbines hanging under the wings, it offered something never seen before: a maximum speed of 870 kilometers per hour, a leap of more than 150 kilometers per hour over any Allied fighter. Its sharp lines, its armament of four 30mm cannons, and the possibility of mounting air-to-air rockets made it a lethal machine for bomber formations. In theory, a single Me-262 could cut through a squadron of B-17 and shoot down several before the gunners could react. But reality was different. The turbines were fragile. Their lifespan barely reached 25 flight hours before needing replacement. Pilot training was rushed, spare parts were scarce, and the infrastructure to maintain full squadrons simply did not exist. Moreover, Hitler ordered that the Me-262 be used as a Schnellbomber, a fast bomber to attack ground targets, delaying its use as a pure fighter. When fighter units were finally deployed, it was too late. Even so, wherever they appeared, the Me-262 inspired respect. They could attack and withdraw at a speed that left the P-51 Mustang powerless, forced to catch them only during takeoff or landing. Alongside the Me-262, another gamble was born: the Heinkel He-162, nicknamed Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. It was the synthesis of desperation, an aircraft built almost entirely of wood, with an engine mounted above the fuselage and designed to be piloted by young men with only a few weeks of instruction. Its speed was impressive, but its stability and safety were deplorable. The accidents during training cost more lives than combat. The He-162 embodied the illusion of mobilizing teenagers to stop the tides of bombers, an idea as delusional as it was tragic. Meanwhile, in hidden hangars and tunnels carved into mountains, even bolder projects were taking shape. Engineer Alexander Lippisch developed the Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered fighter capable of reaching 960 kilometers per hour in vertical ascent. Its hydrogen peroxide engine propelled it like lightning, but only for a few minutes, after which it became a defenseless glider. For pilots, the Comet was almost suicide: an explosive takeoff, a fleeting attack, and a deadly landing on skids. Despite its limited combat success, the Me-163 proved that mastery of supersonic flight was within reach. Even more unsettling were the flying wing projects of the Horten brothers. The Ho-229, a fighter bomber with two jet engines, featured a futuristic design. Fuselage integrated into the wing, minimal silhouette, great speed, and bomb-carrying capacity. Its tests in 1944 and 1945 astonished the Allied technicians who captured it in Gotha. Its shape reduced radar detection at a time when no one yet thought of stealth. The Ho-229 was literally a century ahead of its time, the conceptual precursor of the B-2 stealth bombers that would cross the skies half a century later. All these programs shared a single root: faith that a revolutionary machine could reverse the course of the war. But in every case, the same obstacle repeated itself: lack of resources, logistical chaos, and the pressure of a regime that demanded immediate results. Science required months of testing. The hierarchs demanded prototypes at the front. What could have been the vanguard of a new era ended up as a collection of half-finished miracles. When Allied troops occupied the Luftwaffe hangars, they were astonished by what they found: jet fighters ready to fly, gliders of futuristic lines, experiments with rocket engines. It was as if they had broken into a science fiction laboratory. Those technological remnants became coveted spoils. Soviets and Americans divided engineers, blueprints, and prototypes. In the following years, the Cold War would feed directly on those seeds. The Soviet MiG-15 and the American F-86 Sabre, rivals in Korea, owed much of their DNA to what the Germans had conceived in 1944. The legacy of Nazi jet aviation is as unsettling as it is fascinating. It was the herald of a new era in aerial combat, but also the proof that technology without time or industrial structure cannot save a doomed regime. The Me-262, He-162, Me-163, and Ho-229 did not reverse the outcome of the war, but they marked the beginning of the modern aerial world. There, on Germany's bombed runways among turbines that barely survived a handful of flights, the future began. The Aryan reproduction programs and medical experiments. The Third Reich's obsession with science was not limited to rockets, airplanes, and submarines. It also projected itself onto flesh and blood, onto the very life of human beings. Where engineers designed machines of steel, Nazi bureaucrats and doctors designed bodies, genealogies, and human futures under the dictates of eugenics. It was the other face of the forbidden science. Not the one that promised technological miracles, but the one that sought to mold society with forceps, scalpels, and concentration camps. The starting point was the idea of racial purity. For Hitler and his ideologues, the war was not only about territories or resources, but a biological struggle between races. Victory had to be secured not only on the military front, but also in the wombs of German women. Therefore, from the mid-30s, controlled reproduction programs were launched to multiply the so-called pure Aryans. The Lebensborn organization, created in 1935 under the supervision of Heinrich Himmler, was the epicenter of this plan. At first, it presented itself as an institution to assist single mothers and needy children. In practice, it was a program of selective reproduction. Special clinics, financed by the SS, where women considered racially suitable were encouraged to have children, often with carefully chosen SS officers. The goal was to fill Germany with new biologically valuable generations. Births were celebrated as political achievements. Lineage certificates replaced diplomas. Lebensborn was not limited to Germany. In occupied countries such as Norway, the union between German soldiers and local women was encouraged to improve the genetic stock. Thousands of children were born under this program, many of them torn from their families to be Germanized. After the war, many of those children were persecuted, stigmatized as children of the Nazis, and lived childhoods marked by marginalization. The other face of eugenics was more brutal: the exclusion and elimination of those who did not fit the racial ideal. In 1933, only months after coming to power, the regime passed the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases. Under its authority, more than 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized: the mentally ill, the physically disabled, the deaf, the blind, the epileptic. It was the prelude to something worse. At the end of the 30s, in secret, the program known as Action T4 began, consisting of the systematic murder of disabled and sick people considered lives unworthy of being lived. In hospitals and clinics, Nazi doctors applied lethal injections, gas, or simple starvation to eliminate those who, according to them, consumed resources without contributing to the state. It is estimated that between 70,000 and 100,000 people died in this first extermination campaign. The methods, gas chambers, crematoria, mass transport, were later applied on a large scale in concentration camps against Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. At the same time, the camps became macabre laboratories. Doctors such as Josef Mengele in Auschwitz, Karl Klauberg in Ravensbrück, and Sigmund Rascher in Dachau used prisoners as experimental material. Methods of mass sterilization were tested, from radiation to chemical injections, seeking quick formulas to prevent the reproduction of entire peoples. Hypothermia experiments were carried out, simulating the fall of pilots into icy waters, which ended with victims agonizing in front of stopwatches and notebooks. Saline transfusions were attempted to see how long the human body could resist before dying. Prisoners were infected with typhus and malaria to study treatments. Women were subjected to brutal sterilizations without anesthesia or medical care, with instruments designed to destroy their reproductive capacity. Twins were the object of pseudoscientific obsessions. Mengele selected them, measured them, injected them with experimental substances, and when one died, the other was executed to compare organs. For Nazi doctors, the line between science and sadism disappeared completely. The most terrifying aspect is that many of these practices were cloaked in technical and administrative language. In official reports, murders were special treatments, gas chambers, disinfection facilities, prisoners, human material. Bureaucracy transformed horror into procedure, allowing it to multiply without remorse. At the same time, the regime promoted the exaltation of Aryan motherhood. German women considered fit were rewarded with the Cross of the German Mother for giving birth to 4, 6, or 8 children. Motherhood was presented as a patriotic and military duty. The war, said the propaganda, was fought on the battlefields and also in the cradles. The female body was a territory under state control. This web of selective reproduction, sterilization, extermination, and medical experimentation shows that Nazism conceived of science as a total instrument, not only to create weapons, but to redesign humanity. In its vision, biology could be manipulated like metallurgy or chemistry. Peoples could be shaped like red-hot steel. That logic was what allowed doctors educated in prestigious universities to participate without hesitation in atrocious experiments, convinced they were serving a higher cause. When the war ended, the Nuremberg trials revealed these atrocities to the world. The doctors' trial in 1946 brought to light testimonies, documents, and photographs of the experiments. Several of those responsible were sentenced to death, others to long prison terms. From those hearings emerged the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles on human experimentation that became the foundation of modern bioethics. The paradox is brutal. From Nazi barbarism arose the norms that today protect human dignity in science. But the trauma of the reproduction and eugenics programs did not end in 1945. Thousands of survivors were left physically and psychologically scarred. The Lebensborn children grew up in societies that rejected them. The victims of sterilizations and experiments lived with lifelong consequences, and the memory of what it meant to treat human beings as laboratory pieces remains a permanent warning. If rockets and jet planes represent the technical ambition of the Third Reich, the reproduction and experimentation programs show its darkest side, the attempt to use science to control life itself. The obsession with technological and biological supremacy was not different in essence. In both cases, the logic was the same, that of a dictatorship that saw in science not a tool of progress but a weapon to dominate, subjugate, and exterminate. The Bell and the Flying Discs of the Reich. In the last years of the war, when Germany's industrial youth was bleeding under Allied bombings, stories emerged in the Reich's archives and caverns that blur the boundary between daring engineering and delirious fantasy. Among those stories, 2 figures stand out for their power to fascinate and scandalize. A metallic bell that, it is said, was tested in underground facilities, and the idea of circular aircraft, the famous plates or discs, that some describe as prototypes of anti-gravity technologies. Historical truth, however, requires prudence. Many of these accounts are tinted with late testimonies, controversial reconstructions, and myths that flourished in the post-war period. The legend of Die Glocke, the bell, reached popular culture through accounts describing a bell-shaped apparatus about 3 meters high, made with an unknown alloy and connected to rotary machinery. Chroniclers describe counter-rotating cylinders and an internal purplish fluid, the mythical Serum 525, that supposedly exhibited radioactive properties and lethal biological effects on test animals. According to those narratives, the tests caused the deaths of technicians, clock malfunctions, and strange anomalies in the surroundings. But it must be emphasized, most historians and experts regard these claims as part of post-war conspiracy theories that mix scattered facts with sensationalist hypotheses. Nevertheless, there is one objective fact that fuels the imagination. The Nazis built gigantic underground complexes in the Silesian mountain region, the so-called Project Ries, where tunnels and concrete halls were constructed by forced labor. It is in those real and vast spaces that many versions of the secret tests are situated. That such industrial facilities could house advanced experiments is a documented fact. This does not prove the existence of an anti-gravity machine, but it does explain why the rumors are believable. The tunnels, the large chambers, and the secrecy of the project created a scenario ripe for every kind of story. Parallel to the bell, legend speaks of circular aircraft, Haunebu, Vril, and other names that proliferated in post-war books and magazines, designed with rounded profiles and supposed non-conventional propulsion systems. Among the genuine documents, there do exist investigations and prototypes of non-conventional configuration. The flying wings of the Horten brothers, or experimental designs with unorthodox fuselages, show that German engineering explored beyond established canons. The Horten-Ho 229, for instance, was a jet flying wing prototype captured by the Allies. Its reduced silhouette and advanced nature ignited speculation about stealth capabilities for its time. But the leap from an advanced design to the claim of anti-gravity discs is immense. The available technical evidence does not support the confirmed existence of operational flying discs during the war. The testimonies that sustain the bell or the discs usually mix three ingredients: findings of real industrial and underground structures, fragmentary reports on unconventional research in optics, radio frequency, or materials physics, and the human tendency to fill voids with spectacular stories. In some cases, there are tangible remnants, circular concrete structures that certain post-war expeditions described as foundations or experimental supports. The most rigorous technical studies, however, tend to interpret those remains in industrial terms: machinery bases, cooling towers, foundations, rather than as anti-gravity platforms. What is verifiable is the enormous technological effort that Nazi Germany poured into extreme projects: rocketry, jet aviation, experimental submarines, and underground complexes. That mix of real technical capacity and institutional secrecy was the perfect breeding ground for legends. When in 1945 the Allied forces broke into factories and hangars, they encountered futuristic blueprints, incomplete prototypes, and technology that often surpassed known standards in specific contexts, though not enough to validate physical miracles. Documents, models, and captured aircraft would later feed American and Soviet research during the Cold War, and many pieces ended up as technical spoils in later programs. If one seeks what is impressive without falling into reckless assertion, there are real data that astonish by themselves. Tunnels hundreds of meters long, underground chambers up to 10 meters high, reinforced concrete structures, flying wing prototypes that achieved efficient speeds and profiles for their time, and materials and fuel testing programs that bordered on the experimental. Add to that the evidence that numerous projects were fragmented, relocated, or destroyed at the end of the war, and what remains is a landscape of clues open to multiple interpretations. Many of the most extravagant later stories also incorporate the idea that secret technologies were transferred after the war to powers such as the United States or the USSR through the capture of scientists, real operations like Operation Paperclip, or through clandestine routes. That mix of truth, the capture of specialists, rumor, the transmission of forbidden knowledge, and desire to explain the inexplicable is the raw material of myths. Historically, it is indeed proven that scientists and prototypes were relocated and that German technical knowledge influenced Allied space and military programs. The mythical interpretation, however, demands caution. In the end, the bell and the Nazi discs function as symbols. They condense the real capacity of advanced engineering and the megalomaniac ambition of a regime that sought weapons capable of changing war in spectacular fashion. One can write about them with the tone of wonder or with the rigor of the historian. Both approaches have their audience. If what you want is a chapter that mixes the impressive with the plausible, the appropriate method is to maintain the tension between confirmed documentation, tunnels, prototypes, knowledge transfers, and legend, presenting the latter as what it is, a plausible yet unproven narrative. Hitler's chemical weapons. When looking at the history of chemical weapons in the 20th century, there is a line that runs from the muddy fields of Ypres to the polished laboratories of IG Farben, an arc linking industrial banality with political monstrosity. In interwar Germany, chemistry was not mere science. It was strategic industry, national pride, and a central component of technical modernity. That convergence, brilliant researchers, industrial conglomerates, and a state willing to do anything, created the conditions for compounds that were born as pesticides to be transformed, in the Reich's hands, into what we now understand as the first generation of nerve agents, tabun, sarin, and their relatives. The technical history begins in modest laboratories, with researchers such as Gerhard Schrader working on organophosphates for agricultural protection. What on the surface was a search for insecticides led, through reasons of pure chemistry and experimental chance, to compounds with unprecedented toxicity for mammals. The reactions observed in test animals, contracted pupils, convulsions, respiratory arrest, soon led to a cruel conclusion. It was useless for crops but could serve as a weapon. Tests in large chambers and in field conditions showed that minute quantities were enough to kill. That technical realization alone explains why military bureaucracies paid immediate attention. The practical development of these agents was industrial and therefore colossal. IG Farben and its subsidiaries not only synthesized molecules, they built plants, designed processes, solved issues of loading, corrosion, and storage. Die Herrenfurth became the epicenter, a factory designed to produce tens to hundreds of tons with synthesis plants, waste treatment facilities, and even installations to manufacture hydrogen cyanide as a byproduct. The plant's designs included underground storage capable of holding thousands of tons and filling lines theoretically able to load hundreds of thousands of projectiles per month, an industrial scale that terrifies when one imagines its military application. Field tests, far from being mere simulations, were systematic and scientific in their methodology. Raubkammer, the great testing range, featured chambers, test towers, and a device named Vauze-Turm, a rotating tower that allowed artillery pieces to be fired under reproducible conditions, and to measure aerosol dispersion within a 100-meter test circle, with a complex sampling network on rails and meteorological stations that recorded wind, temperature, and humidity. There, tests were conducted with 105mm ammunition, the FHGR-39 Green Ring 3, that carried approximately 1 6/10 kilograms of the agent as a payload and a burster calibrated to form aerosol, data that make it possible to understand the calculations of range and lethality performed by the technicians. Aerial tests with KC-250 bombs containing between 75 and 88 kilograms of agent yielded more modest results than expected. Dispersion, meteorology, and the agent's own fragility under real conditions reduced the effective radius in many test scenarios. A test on the 30th of August of 1939 exemplifies this. Under favorable conditions, the maximum lethal distance observed was only 87 meters, with detectable, non-lethal effects up to 190 meters, a test that forced scientists to revise their tactical expectations. That tension between theoretical power and practical effectiveness marks a central strategic paradox. In purely destructive terms, the Tabun and sarin agents were extraordinarily potent per kilogram. A small fraction was enough to incapacitate or kill, but turning that power into a useful battlefield weapon required solving logistical, meteorological, and self-survival problems. The high risk of chemical retaliation by an enemy also acted as an inhibiting factor. Mutual vulnerability, the impossibility of isolating the civilian population or one's own reserves, reduced the likelihood of massive use in conventional theaters. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht valued more conventional tactical options, and in the regime's case, internal extermination policies offered atrocious and efficient methods without the risk of retaliation at the front. This point requires a moral and factual distinction. Yes, the Reich developed and produced nerve agents. Yes, it tested them under real conditions and built facilities for their manufacture and filling. But the Nazi machinery of death had already industrialized other forms of killing that for the leadership were cheaper and less risky for their own military project. Zyklon B, a cyanide agent used in gas chambers, was not a nerve agent, and it was preferred for extermination centers for reasons of cost, availability, and logistics. The transfer of a commercial poison to homicidal use in extermination camps reveals the horrific double face of science, the redefinition of a civilian technology into a tool of genocide. No less relevant is the human and environmental cost. The production plants generated extremely toxic waste that was dumped without any long-term environmental accounting. Rivers and nearby communities were contaminated by synthesis processes and waste treatments that had no regulatory counterpart. In addition, much of the labor used in the factories consisted of prisoners and detainees. The production of tabun and sarin was not only technical, but also profoundly immoral in its human exploitation. The filling capacities, hundreds of thousands of projectiles and tens of thousands of bombs, translate into the chilling notion of how much destruction would have been possible had conditions, political decisions, and logistics converged. After the war, the capture of documentation, plants, and scientists transformed this knowledge into post-war assets. Operations such as Paperclip did not only transfer minds, they transferred know-how that fed defensive and, in some cases, offensive programs during the Cold War. But from those revelations also emerged a normative response. The horror of chemical use in conflicts and its criminal domestic application motivated international efforts to limit and prohibit these weapons. The Geneva Protocol of 1925, the Chemical Weapons Convention 1993, and the verification institutions do not erase history, but they represent the modern attempt to place guardrails on a technology that, without ethics, becomes the perfection of mass murder. The technical and moral legacy is therefore twofold. On the one hand, history shows how rapid and efficient scientific advances can be when industrial and military investment align. On the other, it testifies to the ability of technology to be hijacked for criminal purposes. The contemporary lesson is clear. Science without ethical frameworks and international controls is fertile ground for barbarism, and memory is the only real vaccine against repetition. Documenting who did what, where, and with what consequences, recording field tests, production figures, and plant names allows transparency and history to combat the trivialization of what occurred. That is why, in telling this story, the goal is not technical sensationalism, but moral clarity. The numbers, filling capacities, kilograms per bomb, lethal distances in tests, are tools for understanding the magnitude of the project, not for describing methods. And in that understanding lies the most useful legacy. That science itself does not dictate how it is used. It is up to societies and institutions to set limits. The German experience of the 30s and 40s was not so much the triumph of forbidden technology as the convergence of chemical discovery, industrial ambition, and a policy that placed efficiency on the scale of crime. That intersection is what we must remember, study, and repudiate.